Hi, everybody. It's Mary Rowe from the Canadian Urban Institute. Really pleased to welcome you to another City Talk. We're having quite a week this week. We did one earlier this week with a number of partners across the country on Indigenous placemaking with practitioners. And I'm on the traditional, I happen to be in Syracuse, New York with my sister who's recovering from surgery. And this is the traditional territory of the Oneida and the Onondaga First Nation. And we are continuing to come to terms with the legacies of exclusion that city building has perpetuated, and how do we speak to truth and reconciliation with Indigenous communities and with communities of color across the country. And I can tell you from here in Upper New York State, these continue to be issues here as well around legacies of exclusion. And we had a session earlier, as I said, in the week with talking about Indigenous placemaking. And I know that indigeneity is a central part of the participatory cities work. And so I'm looking forward to hearing from our colleagues about how Indigenous principles and Indigenous practice continues to influence the evolution of this program. Participatory cities, I first learned about it from Tessie Britton a number of years ago when she was visiting into Canada, and McConnell quickly knew a good idea when they saw it, and have been working in collaboration with Tessie to see how this could be adapted to Canadian contexts. And these folks that are on this call today are all leaders in their communities who have been prototyping what Participatory Cities Canada might look like. I just want to signal that our appreciation for the sponsors of, well, first of all, the initiators in Canada of participatory cities is the McConnell Foundation, with many, many partners who've come in, some of whom you're going to hear from this morning. But also on this session, the Trillium Foundation is supporting this Maison Investation Sociale in Montreal as well. And Participatory Cities Canada, which has its own sort of foundation here. So it's been terrific to have everybody involved in having this session, which is a slightly different time for a City Talk. So hope our City Talkers that are used to rolling out of bed midday or first thing in the morning in BC have gotten up a little earlier to participate in this session and to hear about this really interesting program and how it's evolving across the country. We're working in 2 languages today, so if you'd like to have simultaneous translation, please take advantage of that. Go to the bottom of your, we should all do that right now. Go to the bottom of your monitor and choose the language that you'd like to hear translated to you. So I've just toggled English so that I can hear English, sadly, but people should feel free to put the language of their choice there, and then you'll be able to hear participants because Yannick, bless him, is here translating for us in real time. And I see Amy nodding, so that must mean the French is working. Yes, c'est vrai. Okay, good. So this is an interesting pilot, or shall we say that? You guys have been at it for over a year. You've learned a ton. You've issued a big fat report, which I hope is in the chat and which I'm hoping is live, so people can click on that. You'll see just a trove of information there and reflections and thoughtfulness about this approach and what it's teaching all of you, what we're hoping you'll teach us, and then potentially what this model could teach the country. And it deals with issues that CUI is fundamentally concerned about, like how do we define infrastructure? What is infrastructure? How do we define connection? I always say that the Canadian Urban Institute's in the connective tissue business. We're trying to build horizontal connections. Canada seems to do vertical quite well. Tessie, I don't know whether you've noticed that in Canada, but we have municipal governments that relate to the province, that relate to the federal government. So we know how to do this, but we don't sort of know how to do that. And we're in a vast geography with a relatively small population. We're half the population of the UK in a landmass that would probably be 6 or 7 times the size of the UK. So it's a challenge, right? We don't have as many cities as we might like to have ultimately, and it makes it difficult to share practices quickly. Whereas in denser environments like in Europe or in Asia or the United States, where there's more mobility between, and ideas move more quickly and people move more quickly. So it's an added challenge for us here in Canada to create new forms of connective tissue, new forms of kind of lateral engagement, so that we learn quickly from each other, and we, as Beckett said, we try and we learn, and we learn faster, we fail faster, we learn better. So that's kind of the deal we're in. And 16 months ago, we were faced with an extraordinary challenge that not everybody was anticipating. Obviously, some smart people were anticipating a pandemic, but lots of us weren't. And we at CUI immediately became attuned to the need to create these sharing platforms, which participatory cities seems to be a really great example of. And it works at the local level, and we want to, of course, see, can it work at the regional level, and can it work at the national level? So I think I've got a bunch of notes that I've made in reviewing the report, because some of the nomenclature that you've used and the way that you're organizing these things, and I'm sure that people will put into the chat their own questions about the program. And feel free to do that, and I will track the chat, feed it back in as people here participate. And we've got 90 minutes, which is a tremendous gift to have this amount of time to really dig deep into this. So I'm going to ask each of you to give us a little overview of how you've approached this particular opportunity. And you don't feel you have to say it all in the first go, but you can give us sort of the high points, key things that you've extracted from this so far. And then I'll pick some themes out and come back to us and have a group conversation. As I suggested, people in the chat should feel free to pose whatever they like, and I'll try to weave those in too. So I'm going to go from east back west. So I'm going to start with you, Pam, if I could. And if you can first of all tell us where you're signing in from, obviously, and then just reflect, if you could, a little bit on your particular experience. And I also know that this program is branded differently. Sometimes it's called Everyone Every Day, and sometimes it's Participatory Cities, and I'm assuming en français c'est un autre nom. So why don't you just fill us in as just give us the flavor of it. And as I said, don't feel you have to cover it all in the first go, but we got time. So maybe we could start with you, Pam. Welcome to City Talk. Great to see you. And we're coming to Halifax in the fall. And we work with Develop Nova Scotia and lots of folks, and we're looking forward to being there for one of our intensives, where I'm sure we're going to learn a ton about your initiatives here. So over to you, Pam. Fill us in.
Perfect. So first of all, I want to acknowledge the traditional territories in which I'm on, which is my Mi'kmaq ancestors. They are on ceded traditional territory. So I just want to acknowledge that. And I am calling in today from Shabuktuk. And Amy is part of our great group in Halifax. And this was a really interesting project that was I came across working with Jane from McConnell Foundation. And then I got the great opportunity to meet Tessie. And we realized pretty quickly that, and I remember having the conversation that actually what Tessie and them are doing is actually a very traditional way of teaching within Indigenous communities. And that's hands-on experiential learning. So it's while it's newly branded, it's probably a very old way of learning. And it intrigued me. And I thought, if we're going to be doing this kind of work, if we're interested in it, we wanted to do it a little bit differently. We wanted to talk about truth and reconciliation. And we knew that there would be challenges with that, because let's be honest, if reconciliation was easy, it would already be done. We would have already moved on. So we recognized out of the get-go that there would be a lot of work, and that we would need a lot of patience and be willing to trip and fall and pick ourselves up. And Tessie and McConnell Foundation were both willing partners in this new endeavor. We all recognize the importance of the work that was going to occur in Halifax, in Shabuktuk, and we charted our path. And I think it's been a good path. It's been a challenging path. As you mentioned, COVID was certainly kept us on our toes, and I'll let Amy speak to the actual Everyone Every Day project. She is our lead person on that. But we took this under our wing and said, okay, let's really talk about truth and reconciliation. And we wanted to weave it throughout everything that we were doing. And we have been blessed that we have seen some pretty quick turnarounds on how we do and how we engage in Halifax. So it's a great conversation, and I could talk about it all day. And of course, I am great for talking. So Mary, you may have to do this to me. But happy to have the deeper conversations. And I know we have like 90 minutes, so there's going to be lots of good conversation.
Let me go to Amy next. Yeah, and don't worry, as you say, it's not like you only get one kick at the can here. We got a good chunk of time, so we can pursue these things. And I'm assuming too that you might want to at some point say, hey, some of these things that didn't work, right? Like, here are the things that we thought might work that didn't work. I wouldn't be the first time that Canadians might say that a model coming out of the UK didn't work. Just saying. So feel free to poke those questions, because we know iteration is part of how we all learn, and so we should feel free to say that too. So Amy, fill us in on your side of the equation, can you?
Sure thing. And just to say, I'm also calling in from Jabuktuk today, the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. So yeah, and I appreciate Pam's framing, because, you know, all of this has been very, very new for me, both the approach of participatory city and thinking about reconciliation. So in Halifax, it was absolutely an intentional approach of ours from the beginning to understand the platform approach to building everyday inclusive participation in and across communities, but also how that platform could serve as a vehicle for reconciliation in neighborhoods. And I would say straight off the bat, we've really been thinking about this at multiple levels. So how does reconciliation manifest in neighborhoods through cross-cultural connections and sharing and learning of cultural traditions and craft, but also at the level of organizations. And so we had many different organizations coming together from the start. And I could talk about it forever. It's been a journey of trying to figure out and understand what it means to shift power dynamics, reassess resource flow, and really do the personal learning that extends from ourselves to our teams to our organizations that is absolutely required for reconciliation. Just very quickly, I mean, honestly, I have so much to say, but just to say, so we actually developed a mini platform in Halifax. So the platform itself was a collection of small spaces across the neighborhood. We had a small team that had existing relationships with residents to co-design participation projects. We developed a newspaper. And for us, that was a very, very powerful tool, both to set the tone and invite a really broad audience in. And I think with those things in place, you know, I'm learning about what this platform is. The other things like peer-to-peer learning, co-design with residents, they fell into place. And if there's one phrase I keep saying from all of this, it's that ideas and innovation and creativity are not a supply problem. Like, this exists in our communities, and our task is to reveal it and to allow ideas to flourish. And anyone working in community understands that. But what this approach does is enable the conditions for that to happen. So I would say that I can talk a whole bunch more about what we saw around the cross-cultural connections, and I would like to talk about that. But there's just two things I want to name up front, which is that the concept of the ecosystem, the idea you spoke about, the connective tissue. So in this network of spaces, I could see how the infrastructure, when connected, works to leverage resources and relationships across. And so if we can think about any community or neighborhood as an ecosystem, then we understand that it's the relationships and the interconnections between those things that actually make all of this happen. And so this is such a clear focus for me. And then secondly is this idea of scale. You know, Tessie, I think what we've seen in London is a lot of participation. And so for me, it's like we did this little small thing in an area of the North End. But now I'm thinking about the scale of the systems of infrastructure, physical and social, that connect to one another, that allow thousands or hundreds of thousands of people to participate. Because to me, that is a very unique difference between what many communities and organizations are very, very good at, you know, enabling community to participate, but it's the system that feels really different. And I don't know, Mary, like, I'm happy to go back. There's a couple of insights just around the reconciliation piece that feel really important to me as well. In our approach to designing this platform, you know, we really focused on working with staff at the Friendship Center and Indigenous community members connected to embed Indigenous knowledge within the platform where we could. And this was really a learning path, but this was intentional time to spend time with elders, integrating Indigenous protocols where we could and where it was appropriate, really building in time to learn and teach across cultures. And for us, we did focus very specifically on Indigenous culture because, you know, we were really working to learn about that. But it was such a beautiful and unique part of what we saw in terms of Indigenous and non-Indigenous community members having safe space to come together to learn about cultural knowledge and traditions, and space for this story sharing. So in intimate, personal settings, we begin to share stories of ourselves that are very small but significant. And I think this is some of the stuff that we started to draw upon, as well as all of these other learnings around what it really means for organizations to practice reconciliation and to extend that to the communities with which we work.
It's interesting, you know, you use that phrase, I use this phrase too, enabling conditions. I always try to help public policy people see themselves less as controllers and more as enablers. But it's hard because lots of people think, oh, no, here are the outcomes we want, and we're going to prescribe how they will be achieved. And it's difficult to move for us all collectively to resist that temptation to say, well, this is how it's got to be, to, as you just suggested, creating the enabling conditions to see what may emerge, which I know is part of the way that you've been approaching this, and this notion of ecosystems and the preoccupation, the primacy of connection, and that connection allows. I want to come back to scale, because I have an allergy to scale, but I know that everybody wants scale, so we can come back and talk about that. So, but thanks, Amy. Great to have a perspective, and I can just see how this, as you suggested, and I can just see how the last 16 months would have incubated this in a certain kind of way, right? It would have been interesting if you were trying to do it in non-COVID times versus in COVID times. So that's part of it. I think it's an interesting learning when we've become so hyper-connected, even though we're physically isolated. Anybody else think that? Like, it's sort of a weird irony. We're physically isolated, but for us at CUI, we are now hyper-connected with people across the country. And without this pandemic, we would never have been able to do that. Isn't that weird? It's kind of perverse, eh? Anyway, Maude, I want to go to you next. Can we go to Québec, la Belle-France, en français, peut-être? Oui? Or en anglais, your choice.
Okay, I usually speak Fringlish anyway, so.
Yeah, Fringlish is fine. That's my kind of Fringlish. Go for it. Over
Excellent. Hi, everyone. So I'm calling in from Montreal, which is unceded Indigenous land of traditional territory of both Mohawk and Algonquin peoples. My name is Maude, and I work for the Solon team. So Solon is a nonprofit local organization in Montreal that enables citizen initiatives working towards ecological and social transition. And so we selected to work in the borough of Ahuntsic-Cartierville, which is the 5th most populated borough in Montreal. Specifically in a sector called Fleury West, which has a lot of newcomers and more marginalized population. We really wanted, the whole goal of all this was really to just build connections, build networks, create a more resilient and sustainable community. And we had such a different experience, and that's what's so rich about all three of the prototypes in Montreal and Halifax and Toronto. We had such a different experience. So we were newly arrived within the ecosystem of Ahuntsic. So Solon had just started implementing some projects. We had to get to, people didn't know who we were, and we couldn't just do some outreach activities in the parks and stuff because we were all in confinement. So we relied, we were guided by Participatory City, mentored by some of their teammates, and we went with the newspaper as well. We created this gorgeous newspaper and distributed it to like 2,500 households, and it basically did nothing. It went put. Because it's not necessarily a traditional medium to reach people in our neighborhood and maybe in Montreal. And so this is where maybe I was told by someone that it's typically British, but I don't know. But we didn't give up. So we kept working with social media, trying to reach people, we resorted to sort of guerrilla marketing styles. And so we created, it was winter time, we had to adapt the whole project. And so we created, some teammates went out and they made snowmen, and then they stuck they stuck signs in the snowmen. They're like, this is our neighborhood, like participate in these amazing projects to build connections. And that kind of worked. So it was strenuous. It was really time consuming lifting this thing off the ground. But once we got people participating in different online projects, and then we created WhatsApp groups, and then you saw the exchanges, just baking bread for your neighbors. So people learned how to bake bread, and then we delivered some materials to people. They made some bread, and then they sent us photos of how they shared it with their neighbors, and the smile on the faces. And so slowly but surely things started lifting off the ground. We got to know the ecosystem. We got to know the local partners. We were really, really well received also with what we were proposing, which is just, building community.
I love that bread baking is in this scheme here. Honestly, I've worked in a number of different cities that I've lived in, and the one unifying thing is food. When in doubt, find a way. There's a reason that people talk about breaking bread together. You can kind of get it. And but I'm interested too, your anecdote about, well, we tried a community newspaper and that fell flat. Like, I think these are what's so interesting. There is a community newspaper. I'm going to go to Toronto next, and Denise may be familiar with it. There is one in Parkdale in Toronto that they've called the West End Phoenix, I think. And it's I subscribe to it, even though I don't live over there. And as you say, it's really highly market sensitive, isn't it? What people want. But I do think this unifying thing about food. The other thing is that you've been going so granular with this, eh? I think that's also hugely important. And I just hats off to your funder that they supported that, because too often, again, as I've suggested, funders look for, public and private funders look for big grand solutions because they want to make it all, solve it up. And they don't allow us the kind of opportunity to work at the hyper local to try some stuff, right? So there you did a news drop and it didn't work. Well, in a small pilot community, that's not the end of the world. You try something else. But if it were a big, large scale system that had invested millions of dollars to do a drop, let's say across the country, and it didn't work, then it's a big mess, right? So isn't it good that you've cultivated a kind of climate of let's try some stuff? Yeah, it's great.
We're experimenting. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, experimenting. And I love, and as you say, the other thing about bread, it seems as if, except for the keto people, whoever they are, it seems as if bread kind of straddles all sorts of cultural traditions, right?
Absolutely.
And so that's such a powerful metaphor. Okay, Denise, let's go to you now, if we could, in Tirana, which is normally where I am, but I'm not today. And you're particularly in Regent Park, which is only a few blocks from my house, at my apartment. So talk to us about what your experience has been. And I know it's through the Center for Social Innovation. And talk to us a little bit about the Regent Park experience and how. Did you have bread involved too?
Thanks so much, Mary. We did not have bread involved. We actually made a very conscious decision to not do bread baking, just because of the demographics of Regent Park. And so just another sort of little tweak on the program.
Yeah.
And I apologize, there is a competing Zoom call upstairs for those who can hear that in the background. But I am in Toronto. I'm not currently in Regent Park, but I am in Toronto, which is part of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, and most recently the land of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations, among others. And so Regent Park is a pretty specific, or a pretty unique little corner of Toronto. It is one of the oldest and largest social housing projects in Canada, and has gone through revitalization 3 times. And each time they've done that, it's been the most innovative thing they've ever done. And now we're doing it again. And the hope is that this is the most innovative. And one of the reasons why it is the most innovative, and this was a vision of the Daniels Corporation and Toronto Community Housing, was to actually include not just a physical revitalization and to knock the community down to the ground and rebuild from scratch, but to also include a social development plan, which is fairly innovative. I will give them that. And the reason for the social development plan is that you obviously want to pull cohesion into the community. You don't just want beautiful buildings and new spaces. You do want that sort of social cohesion to come together. So this has been revitalization has been happening in Regent Park for probably the last 15 years, and we have probably another at least 5 years to go. And the other sort of innovative thing that's happened in Regent Park, and I'm just setting the stage so that you understand why this is an important program in this particular neighborhood in Regent Park, which is about 10,000 people. The other thing that happened as part of revitalization was to actually take it from a fully social housing community to a mixed market strata with both with all social housing, rent geared to income, reduced market value rent through Toronto community housing, and then market value condos for purchase and for rent in buildings. And to look through Regent Park, you would not know which buildings are which was part of the point of this. So again, that just sort of sets the stage for Regent Park. It has one of the most diverse populations in all of Toronto. It also scores lower in terms of access, economic access. There's a lot of poverty, people living sort of below the poverty line. But there's also a lot of sort of services. So that's Regent Park in a nutshell. CSI has been in Regent Park for the last 8 years. We've run a co-working space and launchpad and community space in the Daniel Spector building, which is a community asset. And why did we do this? We've always been sort of trying to find our place in Regent Park, trying to figure out, where we sort of fit between the social organizations. And what we've realized is that we're really good at creating this sort of social ecosystem and supporting residents in sort of realizing their wants and their desires and their sort of ideas and being able to unlock. And what Participatory Cities and the Everyone Everyday project offered us were tools to be able to give people multiple points of entry to a social ecosystem. What we have learned in our time in Regent Park is that there are people who are heavily involved in the neighborhood in terms of the political structure, the governance structure, the social development plan, all of those kinds of things. But sometimes it's really hard to pull the market value residents and the TCHC residents together in a fun way. And that this was a really nice way to be able to offer lots of different options. And like I said, we decided not to do bread baking just because there is a rich food culture in Regent Park, and bread baking. We sort of made a decision that it was kind of ethnocentric in a way, but that we did do lots of other sort of food things. One of the things that took off was hydroponic growing, if you can imagine, that people were super interested in growing their own food and being able to do so in their own apartments. And so the ability to be able to we offered 12 different project workshops in the beginning that were sort of COVID proof, that we could offer online, that people could do together, gave us a really nice way to bring together market value residents and TCHC residents in a way that was about their interests, not about what they needed, not about what they needed to get from services or anything like that. It was just like, are you interested in gardening? Are you interested in painting? And so we got these really unique groups of people together on Zoom calls to be able to create a community mural together, or to build a community garden together. And in so doing, we were building social infrastructure. And we have now we're sort of a few months out from that initial phase. That's the initial phase of last winter. And I'm seeing that infrastructure develop and the sort of fruits that are coming from that infrastructure, that I'm seeing neighbors who before weren't connected, who come and walk through the neighborhood. I watch them, I watch them, their kids are playing together and they're offering each other jobs, or they're offering each other, services and connection. And I think that social infrastructure and those sort of social ecosystems that we're building are the building blocks for strong, resilient communities, which is, of course, what we're all doing here. Like, that is the nature of what we're all doing here. We've sort of moved into a community wealth building place in terms of how we're making sense of the work that we're doing in Regent Park. And of course, those building blocks of relationships from one person to another is how we further the conversations of the systems. Without those relationships on the ground floor, there isn't trust, there isn't cohesion, there isn't collaboration. And you can't, we talked about scale has come up, and you can't scale if you don't have a strong foundation. And I really believe, and we really believe that this project helped us to put more of those building blocks in place to be able to scale into systems change. But it starts, as we know, and as you said, that sort of granular level of like person to person interaction is how we take that from a community to a strong community to a systems change across a nation.
Yeah, I'm somewhat familiar with a lot of the challenges at Regent Park because I was involved at the beginning during this as you say, there's been several iterations, but I was involved 20 years ago on the social plan, the creation of a social plan. And I'm interested, as you say, I walk through the neighborhood all the time, and interesting in terms of the engagement challenges you've had there, Denise. This is a racially extremely diverse community. and suddenly market units were brought in and the socioeconomic mix dramatically changed. And there was tons of anxiety about whether that was going to displace people, but also just change the dynamic of the sort of, how are you observing that? This is, what an interesting place for you to put participatory cities, because this is a neighborhood that had a sudden shock, being the introduction of market rental housing. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, I don't think that I don't think it's caused problems necessarily, but what we do see is that there's still this sort of disconnect. There's still this, like, you know, the TCHC residents do some things and the market value residents do other things. CSI has been in a really unique position because we're engaged, and myself actually at an even more unique position. We're engaged in different channels in the neighborhood. We're engaged because we have the co-working space. We're engaged because we're part of the social development plan. I happen to own a small social enterprise in the community that I see a lot of the community sort of pass through because ice cream is popular. And what I noticed is that in those three ways, we saw very different groups of people. We saw one set of people that came to the social development plan. We saw one set of people that came to the CSI space. Then I saw another different group of people that came to the ice cream parlor. And I thought for a long time, I thought that I knew all of Regent Park. And then we launched this project and I met people that I hadn't met before after working in the community for 3 years. And what that said to me was, this is actually a different way of engaging people. It's a different entry point, and it gives people a barrier-free access to, like I said, interest-based connection. And, you know, it's ready-made. I'm going to make a weird analogy. When I was a smoker, I connected with other smokers because I had a lighter in my pocket, I had cigarettes in my pocket, and we could just do a thing because we all smoked cigarettes. And so it was this sort of common experience and common understanding. So when we gathered people together because they were into art, or because they were interested in hydroponic growing, or that they were interested in the trees of the community, those people had a shared interest in a shared value system just because of signing up for this project. And so the conversation then flowed easier than having to make those connections in the community, and particularly during COVID.
But the dilemma, though, is this: when you suggest barrier-free, like, I'm not sure anything's barrier-free, right, ultimately, but the dilemma is that we didn't have the benefit of actual public space. Yeah. And so I want to come back to that and hear how people are imagining, what's this going to look like when the public health restrictions are lifted and we can more freely move in public space. Karen, can I go to you next? Karen's actually based in Edmonton, but she's the coordinator of Participatory Cities. And I'd like to get a sense from her what you've been observing in terms of your partners. And then I'm going to come to you, Tessie, so that we haven't forgotten that you are there. Go ahead, Karen.
Hi, everyone. Wow, I can listen to these ladies all day long. So I am calling in from Amiskwitchi, Waskakian, aka Beaver Hill House, aka Edmonton, on traditional Treaty 6 territory. So there's so much activity happening. I feel like out east, I'm all the way out here out west, and just it's been such a ride. I mean, when I first joined this initiative, COVID wasn't there, and I was anticipating so much travel and meeting all of these folks in person, but none of that happened. And I think certainly COVID has turned everything, literally everything, upside down. And, we have become this one Zoom family, and seeing each other over the phone or just in these little square boxes. And I was really drawn to Participatory Canada, really for the transformative vision and that it offered. And, I think this past year we've seen sort of a glimpse of that. And being the sort of this development manager role with this initiative, I have the pleasure of really kind of seeing everything that these folks are talking about kind of at a much higher level. And I think there's a few themes that they all touched on that I think is actually quite universal. And we see it, I certainly see it here in Edmonton as well. The themes around the social disconnect, between different groups of people. We've heard lots, and, you can really dive deep into our massive report that's available online. Things that, we've heard in Jibuktuk in Halifax around communities living in parallel for a very long time. And, now it's time to kind of get together. And, we've heard that in Montreal, where, the Salon team refers to this as turnkey projects about bringing people together. And, residents feel that there's always so many targeted services and programs, but very few that really kind of bring different groups of people together. And then, Denise was, really articulate about like, everything she had observed over the years and, the development in Regent Park. So I thought that was a really interesting, and that's something I'm seeing here in Edmonton as well. And then the other piece is this, we're not talking about a service, we're not talking about targeted program. And I think in all of these communities and everyone here has such, deep experience with community development. And often we have lots of different programs as perhaps seniors or, youth or for newcomers or, but what are that network? What is that connected tissue? What is that, that thing that weaves everything together? And so that's something that's been a huge learning, at least for me in this whole process. And then I think the third piece that everyone here has really touched on is sort of this diversity of programs. I actually remember, at the beginning of the conversation with the Halifax team, there's a lot of talk around food actually, and we really had, what about people who don't want to make bread, or what about people who don't want to, like eat or make things? What are some of the other pieces? And so I think it's been so interesting to see how that diversity are drawing people together. Like Denise was saying, it's a different entryway to kind of enter into this ecosystem. And too often we have people and really engaged, residents who might be on this committee and that committee, and you're doing really, lots of heavy lifting, but it tends to be a particular type of people, who might be educated, they might be of a certain socioeconomic status, they might be of particular gender or particular race, they speak English really well, et cetera, et cetera. But what about the rest? What about the single parents, with a number of kids in the household under the age of 5? What about those shift workers who can never make it to this very narrow opening window of this community hub, for example? And I think the key is, these are the type of infrastructure that we actually really need at the neighborhood, at the community level. Too often we rely on those weaving, that human relationship to develop either through free labor, through volunteers, or, just, we give very meager resources to a lot of nonprofits or civil society and just expect it to happen. And the more I've learned in this whole past year and a half is that it doesn't necessarily always just spontaneously happen. And it takes intention, it takes investment, and it takes resource. It takes animation. We have identified a number of pieces in this, what we call, this participatory city approach. And newspaper is actually a really important part of that. So I think it's good to know it doesn't always work in every context, but certainly space, I know we'll touch on that a little bit, but the networks and the resources that animating of spaces with the people involved and the relationships involved is hugely critical. So I'll just maybe end on something that has always really inspired me. Is the first time I heard this presentation from Tessie herself. This is over a year and a half ago, or almost a year and a half ago. And she said, if the system isn't working, we build our own. And these are all examples of people just rolling up their sleeves and taking things into their own hands and creating their own systems. And I think that's really beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Karen. Certainly when COVID hit, we at CUI, we thought we have to create some kind of sharing platform because we knew there would be a ton of improvisation, that the systems were going to get completely taxed and pushed and they wouldn't be able to respond. And so, as you just suggested, Karen, when systems aren't working, people start to create their own. And many of us use in our career all the time, well, what's the workaround, right? I remember when I was first working and I heard some senior person say workaround. I thought, wait, what do you mean? What do you mean? You mean we have to work around things? I thought we were working with things, So this notion of how, I think there's been a ton of workarounds and improvisations and ground up responses that have had to be respected during COVID because there just weren't enough hands, right? You couldn't sort of say, no, government does this or so-and-so does that. But now we're in this interesting transition point. Does this get formalized, right? And there you are working with philanthropic capital to test a model that if it's really true, this kind of social infrastructure is critical, then we probably need public investment now to help make it sustainable and formalizing. So I might come to you next, Tessie, and just get a reflection from you, because you've been at it for a long time in the UK and probably have seen these kinds of eruptions of creative this and creative that. Does it actually form up? And what's your experience been watching it over a period of time? Does it eventually get formalized, and then does government come in and support, or what's your experience so far? Nice to have you. Thanks for joining across the pond.
Thanks, Mary. That's you rolled about 15 questions in there. Thank you.
No, that's okay. I thought, not that you need prompting, but I'll give you something to work with.
I know. I was expecting it from you, Mary. Yes, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really thrilled to be here and thrilled to see and hear from the folks that we've been working with over the last 18 months. And really just want to start by just giving them huge credit for what they've achieved over the last few months in the height of a pandemic. I do absolutely think it's extraordinary, and I think there were moments where it would have seemed much more sensible to actually sort of pause everything and just say, look, we'll do it after things, recover, whatever. And every single one of these 3 teams have powered through the pandemic with complete determination to see what value we could give even in these times. So really just want to send my admiration for working in the harshest possible conditions, when the whole thing is designed to bring people together and actually they couldn't, they needed to be apart. So just really so much respect for everything that's been done, and so excited about the potential as well, because we've been developing this model, worked across the whole of the UK, but it's only really in the last few years that it's become much more solid, much more robust, kind of an adaptive approach. And to see it working in these different contexts has been really thrilling on so many levels. I've forgotten all your other questions now. Now that I've preambled, Mary, I've forgotten all 15 of those.
No, that's okay. Well, I can, and don't worry, I had a dog bark in the middle of all that. But I guess the question is, does it norm? Does it eventually? I mean, we're going to talk about scale here, and at some point, if this kind of infrastructure is crucial to the vitality and viability, let's say, of communities, is it appropriate that the public sector comes in and provides resources? And does it then become just part of the way things get done? Is it too early to observe that, or what are you seeing in the UK?
No, I think I think it's a process, and I think it's a process of transition. And I think that ultimately where we see the sort of end point of this, the sort of the completion of it, is where practical participation is built into everyday life. And in order to do that, you have to build it with people. So it's a process that takes time. And so what we started in year 1 was a sort of, you build it, because you're building it with people, you have to work at that pace. You can't sort of just deposit it on there. You have to work with people all the way through. Every single aspect has to be done with people. So it's a big co-creation effort. And then I think that begins to, when we talk about scale, it's very much more about making sure that this involvement, this participation isn't for some people some of the time, that it's for everybody and it's every day. And so I think that's really what we're talking about when we talk about scale, is building sufficient resources and infrastructure that enables that level of inclusivity, that it's not just a small number of people doing it, that may be more confident, that may be better served. You had some examples. Some people are working 2 jobs and they're looking at raising children, and they're looking after elderly parents. We need social infrastructure which enables every single person to find a way of plugging into this ecosystem of participation, so that they can both contribute, but they can also benefit from that, because this is such a co-creation effort. So I think when we talk about scale, that's really what we're talking about, is making sure that it is big enough, the opportunities that are sufficiently dense and diverse enough that everybody can find a way of taking part in that. So yes, and I think that the public sector, at the moment, we have our local council contributes, we have the City of London contributes in different ways. But I think that it's completely appropriate that they should do it. And really how we'd like to see it develop is that it starts to be viewed the same way that parks and roads and libraries are, that this is seeing social infrastructure. So yeah.
Yeah, this is the challenge, I guess. Here in Canada, we've been inundated with national programs, national support programs during COVID at a scale that none of us in our lifetimes have ever seen in Canada. So billions and billions of dollars that have been allocated nationally and sent down. And some of it gets down into local communities in relevant ways, and some of it gets clogged at the provincial gatekeeping group that say, no, we wanted to go over here, So I mean, there's a question I'll say in the chat about how critically important do you think this model is to being place-based, to start at the local? Can I get a sense? Amy, you're nodding. Do you want to respond to that? And then I do want to hear from Denise and others about this question about scale. How do we then square it with scale? So Amy, over to you on local.
I was just going to say, because I think I'm really glad what Tessie's saying makes all the sense to me. So that's a good sign. But like I think the place-based question and the scale seem interconnected to me, because again, when I speak about scale, I don't mean the way a funder might say, how does this thing scale out or up or whatever. It's about the scale of participation. But the approach to designing that platform is hyper local, which is what's so unique about this, because it's neighborhood based. And there's been a couple of times where I was like, is this just placemaking? Like, what are we actually doing here? No, we're creating opportunities and infrastructure for neighbors to come together and be in spaces that they may not have otherwise been in, and experience something that they might not otherwise have experienced, because the invitation's different, the opportunity's different. There's a safe, welcoming environment for that level of participation to happen. And I think the way the scale happens is in the thoughtful design of the hyper local infrastructure and the teams that then layer in to support that. It looks different everywhere, but the scale of participation becomes very, very big.
And somehow the funding though has to be flexible enough that, as you say, you can have hyper local approaches, right?
So, and then this piece, which I think what we've been able to see in London, which is very inspiring to me, is how this then extends to inclusive economic activity, because you've got this hyper local infrastructure connected to what we see in London, warehouses, maker spaces, these bigger pieces of infrastructure that can exist across a city or a province and be connected to the hyper local infrastructure. So these investments need to be linked. And inclusivity needs to be thought about the whole way, in terms of it being a cyclical process where residents are engaged in every single element of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to go to Denise and then to Pam.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I think that scale is maybe not the correct term. Like, scale is like, take this thing and grow it so it's massive, and then we can just like sort of plop it down in different places. And I think that one of the reasons why, and I don't know this, but I'm making a guess, I think one of the reasons why we did 3 pilots in very different places with very different demographics is to figure out what pieces of the models should be there, like what pieces of the models should exist, and what pieces of the models actually need to be adjusted and shifted and changed, so that each local, hyper local neighborhood, whether it's across Toronto, whether it's across Ontario, whether it's across Halifax, like Nova Scotia, whether it's across Canada, that we can shift and adapt and change, so that the programs meet the needs of these tiny little spaces that bread baking works in Barking and Dagenham. Newspapers worked in Regent Park. They didn't work in Halifax, or sorry, in Montreal. And so these are the pieces that it's about where you're at and how you can shift and adjust, rather than scaling. We're actually talking about adapting and replicating. And I think how we create a model is that, again, we figure out the pieces that absolutely need to be present. And some of the pieces that need to be present are people need to be able to access in the way that they want to. They need to be able to, law of 2 feet. They need to be able to join based on what speaks to them and how they feel called to interact. But some of the other pieces, the design pieces, actually need to be adjusted so that people are feeling that they can see themselves in these programs. And so I think, though I think that this kind of program could work in every community, it absolutely will not scale and work the same in every community. And so I think that it's a super important model. But I think that the understanding needs to be that it has to be adapted and changed with the voices of residents and with the voices of community to inform how it gets adapted and changed in order for it to be successful across larger spaces or across multiple communities.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's lots of old terms we used to use for this kind of thing, mutual aid societies, and there are different communities where mutual aid is more largely understood. When I moved to the US, I had to adjust my mind to realizing that churches in Canada were more secularized, and so churches weren't necessarily seen as delivery vehicles as much. But in the southern US, where I was living, I quickly had to realize that was in fact a key part of the social infrastructure, and that those faith institutions were challenged to be more inclusive. And we can see the legacy of faith institutions in negative ways all around us. And yet this was a service vehicle that was familiar. And how do you actually work in partnership with those kinds of institutions? We think of public libraries. Canada has a long history of settlement houses for newcomers. All these things, are there ways to appropriate back the community function that these places once held in ways that get the good without the bad? Pam, can I come to you next to get some comments from you?
Yeah, and that actually, Mary, what we're talking about is something I wanted to raise, and that's the social infrastructure and how we approach that. It really has to come from the community for the community. We have to reinvest in the communities, and that's not been done. It's been all about individual investments and benefits, and we have to really pull ourselves back. And I talk about this as 7 generational planning, right?
Do you mean during COVID, or do you mean just generally?
Just in general. COVID certainly highlighted a huge piece of the reason for the need for real investment in social infrastructure. Mm-hmm. We need to
but income support historically in Canada has been to the individual or the household, right?
Right, but I'm
talking
reevaluating that benefit of community first. So excess lands, which to me is crazy to even think that there's excess lands, because that's another whole different conversation for me. But when there are lands available, the investment should be going into the community benefits. What benefits the community? And because once you start investing in those kinds of infrastructures, you are building a resilient people. You are building capacity in community. You are building a much stronger, united community. And at one time, for us as an Indigenous person, it was always about the benefit of community. And we have lost that. And we're more worried about individual rights, individual needs, instead of the benefits of community and making sure the community comes first. We all listen, I'm the first one. I've been fighting this fight for a long time for Indigenous peoples to have a voice. The reality is, if you're coming from a marginalized community, you're fighting all the time. You are fighting to have your voice heard. You're fighting to have a place at the table or at that conference. You're fighting all the time. And the reality is, we need to look at land ownership differently. And I'm a firm believer, listen, we don't own land. That was a made up system. Somebody came in and drew a line. The land owns us, and someday we're all going back to it. So make no mistakes there. We need to be better stewards of the social infrastructure and how that gets to make real benefits, and I seen somebody had asked about the kids, where are the kids involved in this? Well, I got to tell you, even as a small child, we were expected to go and pick the berries and be part of the processing. We were expected to go fishing for Yes, even eels, which I still don't enjoy. But you know, we were expected to do that, and you were expected to learn the processes, and you shared that with your friends, your family, the next generation. It was a very natural way of learning, and that's what we need to get back to. And I think Tessie's this particular project can do just that. You're talking about building a much more resilient community, a much more stronger community, and one that understands each other in a much better way, instead of the silo approach, which we're all familiar with. If anybody's in this great Turtle Island of ours, we all know that, you know, we're very good at being siloed. We're very good at it. We, you know, we're all working with our head down. You're just, you know, you're just doing what you need to do. And we just need to step back, lift our heads up and look around to say, okay, how can we be doing this much better? And I do believe that it falls back in very traditional ways of learning and being.
Yeah, I mean, interesting. First of all, just lots of good questions coming up in the chat, and it's really great if other people respond because there's so many things being pinged over there. So I appreciate people that are responding to each other on that. Questions on rules and what do you know, how much do you have to involve the municipality, because they'll tend to say no because they got liability issues or whatever. Concerns around insurance. Questions about interesting question from our colleague in South Africa who often comes on. Asking about whether it's a pretty important big question. Are you observing in Canada that some of the some of the best progress on reconciliation may in fact be happening in cities where Indigenous urban residents and non-Indigenous urban residents can solve problems together and interact? Is that a lesson for the country? To start at the local. So I'll just leave that with you guys to tackle. And then this point that Pam just made about land. We hear that often, I would say, at CUI. Why isn't all public land, whether it's owned by the federal, provincial, I mean, I agree with you, it's not owned by anybody, but you know what I'm getting. If it currently is technically owned by the province, the feds, or the local municipality, why should it ever be put into the market? Why shouldn't the default be that the first option is that it be made available for community use, right? And in the UK, we're seeing that even in terms of commercial enterprises where communities are buying back their pubs. So some interesting questions about that. And why wouldn't that just be written? Why wouldn't that just be general purpose practice so that social purpose real estate would have some traction? Are you seeing that kind of thing yet in Halifax, Pam, where people are actually starting to ask those questions?
Yeah, I certainly have seen even our approach to some of the, how do I put this? So when we first started in Halifax, we had it set up that the funds would flow to a charity. That charity would flow the funds to us. So it would go McConnell charity to another charity because we're an actual registered charity. And I think, Amy, correct me, but it was an aha moment for, I think, a lot of people when and I'm going to say who it was because I'm totally proud of them. It was actually United Way kind of looked at us and said, well, if we're doing this differently, why is it we're going to be monitoring you? And why is it you have to be accountable to United Way? And I have to say, Sarah and Sue, who are with United Way, thought long and hard on that approach. And that was the beauty of this particular project. It got people starting to think differently in their approach of working with Indigenous peoples. We've been around a long time. We're a not-for-profit. We're a registered charity. We're not small by any means. And yet it was an aha moment for United Way when they said, well, why are we doing it the old way when we should be doing it the new way? If this is the process that we're trying to do in Halifax, why is it that we're still trying to do things the old way?
Yeah.
And I had even, I think Amy and I had a couple conversations before this happening, and it was a frustration. And then it was a great conversation with United Way, and it changed, it shifted. So that small shift has begun a very different relationship with United Way and the Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Society located in Halifax. And you could see all the people sitting around our strategic team looking and thinking, yeah, why is it that we were? And so the conversation has started. And listen, there's going to be a lot of trips and falls. And the thing is you're building a relationship with people. So we're all going to be there together to help and pick each other up, because we are going to make mistakes. Truth and reconciliation is not easy. It's not easy. It'd be done if it was. We have half the truth hasn't even been told yet. You know, we're just now finding some of our children.
Right.
And, you know, I keep saying, I hope this is the aha moment for Turtle Island or Canada. And you just hope and pray that this is it, that all of us, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, will stand there together to give those children back their voices and their identity. We will all carry those children home in one way or another. So that's where, you know, this particular strategic group, and I suspect it'll grow. Some people will come and go. And it's about building the long-term relationships, and this platform has given us that opportunity. And yes, we are very different in Shubuktux. I recognize that. We knew that it was going to be different and there would be challenges, but it's worth the journey. It's worth the fight. It's worth the trips and falls. It's worth all of it, because you are beginning to see a very different relationship.
Yeah.
We're not seen as a drain on society. We're not seen, like, people are starting to shift in how they view what we're doing. Lots of great questions coming from people. We've had lots of questions, even the fact that this is a UK model coming to us again. And these are real conversations, right? And I'll be the first one to say, yes, I recognize that this is a UK model, and people will argue, well, that's a UK model. That, look at what it's done to us in the past. Well, you know what? Education will get us out of all of this. And this particular project is one that's being joint. It's a joint project. It's not being done to us. We're partnering to change how we do things differently. And I think that's the beauty of this, is that we are able to ask the questions that need to be asked. And they're tough conversations sometimes, but we have got to get past, you know, I shouldn't say we have to get past. We have to recognize that there are tough conversations. We have to recognize that we have way more in common than we do against each other. And if we find those common ground pieces, we all want the same things. We all want safe, affordable access to housing, access to food security. We all want the same things, regardless of where you're coming from. And I think those are pretty solid ground pieces to be working from.
Yeah, I keep using my little image, you know, we got to go from this to this. I want to ask Maud a question about institutional resistance. You're working in a whole different cultural context. And I'm interested, as you've been exploring this approach in the neighborhood that you've been working in, have you experienced similar or different kinds of challenges from institutions? And also interested about the business community, because you've got some, I would say that in Quebec, not to generalize, but there is I think a further thinking of social business and maybe than in other parts of the country. So have you had run up against that, some institutional resistance, and how have you sort of, or have you not? They've all been a pushover over there.
Actually, no, it has. Everybody's been very welcoming. The borough council has been extremely, welcoming. Everyone's been very enthusiastic about the approach that we were proposing here. We were arriving into this already fully established ecosystem of mostly service-based community organizations, and I gotta say, I mean, people have been generally really welcoming, wanting to work with us, and curious about what we were proposing.
Maybe I can ask Tessie.
Pushback.
Yeah, it's interesting to me where we would find resistance, you know, and if you're saying that, Patty, that's great. Tessie, I think may have to drop off. So Tessie, do you have some thoughts on this? I bet you've had a bunch of knocks through the process. What would your advice be to this gang? You're muted, Tessie.
It's generally the best way to engage with me is when I'm in mute, Mary. Yeah, I mean, I think that the broader you can make it, the more system-based you can make it in its sort of conception right from the beginning, the better. And I think that the temptation is, now that we've started these three pilots, is to is to start doing things too quickly. And I think you do have to build quite a lot of infrastructure and support and resources before you get started again, because what you're doing is you're inviting residents into something that you want to be much more long term. So I think it's just so important that all the groundwork gets done in preparation from that. Can I pick up on something else, Mary? I just really wanted to sort of talk about the outcomes, because I think that's still one of the things that are very important to everybody, that this has an impact, because it's a very hard work, and we want it to be meaningful. So I think one of the realizations we've had recently is that we've spent a lot of time gathering data and researching the many outcomes of the peer-to-peer practical participation and what it creates. And we've done this very systematically and very rigorously. And it's led to this evolving outcomes framework, which is fairly detailed. And we've done this with participants. And as I say, we've done it as rigorously as we can. And we're at the point now where we've got a sort of this outcomes framework. We've got sort of 8 categories of outcomes. And the point is that when lots and lots of people participate there, it produces a lot of outcomes. But I think one of the things that's really become clearer to me as we sort of stand back and look at it in the context of 2021 is that they're not all equal. They're all important, and at a stage later we'll have quantified them, and we'll have a sort of hierarchy of outcomes, whether it's health or employment or the environment, all of those sorts of things. The thing that really stands out for me is that this approach is really, the most important aspect of it is about cohesion. It's about relationships between people. And I think that the reason why it's important is that it is a unique approach to doing that. This sort of inclusivity, which is at the core of the whole design, is so fundamental to what we're doing. And I think what we've also seen is that creating polarization and conflict and negative stuff, that is relatively easy to achieve. It can be done through broadcast methods, and people can do it through online means, through all the media at our disposal. But cohesion, and with that reconciliation as well, it requires people to build relationships between each other. It requires that people leave the comfort of their own home and go into spaces that they've never been into, that they don't know people at, that they take enormous social risk to do that. That's the kind of thing which creates cohesion between peoples, and the counterbalance to all of this polarization and conflict that we've seen being built over the last few years. I mean, it's just as strong here as anywhere. We've had the whole Brexit campaign was sort of really spearheaded by that, and there's some people in the borough who think they felt the effects of that. So I think that what mustn't be underestimated is, firstly, how difficult it is to get people out and together across differences. It is hugely difficult. Anybody who's done community development work of any kind will know how hard it is to actually achieve that. And so there are lots of ways of building cooperatives. There are lots of ways of doing lots of other things that we do that can be done in pieces. But the thing that's really fundamentally different about this approach of working with the building ecosystems where everybody can contribute and participate, that's the single biggest reason why I would invest in this. I would push all of those other outcomes are important and relevant, but the thing which is most important part of this approach, and most important to me certainly, and I think important to many people who've been involved in Canada, is that it's about building relationships and networks between people and counterbalancing all of this negativity and polarization. And it's heavy lifting. It takes a lot. It takes, sometimes we use the phrase, we've thrown the kitchen sink at it. We put out 70,000 48-page newspapers. you know, that's not easy stuff. That's about creating as many opportunities as possible to bring people into the spaces together, to do common denominator stuff, even if it's for half an hour or an hour. You have to do that kind of, that's the heavy lifting required to sort of change the way the world is heading and the kind of experiences we've had. So I just wanted to sort of add that as a sort of, I think just to say that I think it's so important part of what we're doing.
Tessie, are there other communities where this is being tried as well? I mean, I know that you're in the two neighborhoods in London. Anywhere else other than here in Canada? Anywhere else where there's some interest?
We're talking to about 6 boroughs in Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's a coincidence, isn't it? It's sort of Scotland, Canada, New Zealand, sort of the enlightened well-being, the economy, kind of open-minded side of things. Can I just one more point? I think that one of the things which is just to touch on what Pam was saying about you know, the fact that we've developed this in the UK and it's a UK seen as a UK model. I think that the idea of it being adaptive, it's sort of adaptive by design. So it's an approach which means that all the raw ingredients, all the people, the ideas, the spaces, those are all local, all those things. So the process that comes with the approach will bake a different cake everywhere because it's the people, because it's such a co-creation effort. So it's not just about saying, oh, here's a sort of static model. It's an adaptive model which works in individual places.
Yeah, I mean, for years, we talked about participatory budgeting coming out of Porto Alegre. So it came out of the particular place and then it was adapted all around the world. So it's just, but I think there's an extra kind of layer in terms of Canada's history, but obviously, but I was just interested about whether or not there was an interest being shown in the model in other places. One question for all of you would be size. When Tessie says borough, how many people in a borough generally, Tessie?
They vary enormously. Some of the cities we're talking to in Scotland are 50 or 75,000 people. The one we're working on at the moment is over 200,000. So large. I think the borough is relevant in terms of partnerships and
sure. And yes, and which order of government you partner with. But I'm curious if either Amy or Maude or Denise have a view on this in terms of the size of the neighborhood, either the geographic size or the population size. Anybody wrap their head around that? Maude, I see you nodding. Do you have a sense of what the optimal size is to start?
Oh, wow. Well, Solon works at a very, very, very local level when we initiate projects and stuff. So we're present in both the Ahuntsic-Cartierville borough in Montreal and Rosemont-Petite-Patrie. But we work, on travaille avec des voisinages, des milieux de vie. So in Ahuntsic, we're very, very present in the Fleury West section, which has about 5,000 residents. But the borough itself has 134,000 residents. So we just selected a specific portion, a specific area, and we really targeted an area where there was a lot of ethnocultural diversity.
Yeah. Anybody else got a sense of that about the optimal size? Because we hear this lots about, is there the optimal size of a city? Is there an optimal size of a neighborhood? Anybody else wrapping their head around this, either Amy or Denise, in terms of size, either spatial size or population size? Anybody have a sense? Denise?
Yeah. Just a quick note. I mean, we're just over 10,000 people in Regent Park, and I think that might be pushing the boundaries. Like, I think that might be pushing the upper end. Yeah. Of how you create a sense of community with people. I think that people have an identity about Regent Park, but it's very hard to bring that many people and that many sort of different groups of people together. We also have a very diverse community. So I think somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 is your answer. And that depends on so many different things. It depends on, what's the makeup and everything else.
Yeah. Maude wants to jump in too. Go ahead, Maude.
Walking distance. That's kind of like the way that 5 to 10 minute walking distance is how far you got to go to get to your neighbor's house.
5 to 10 minutes. It's interesting, Zita Cobb has a phrase that community is the distance that a person can walk in a day. That's a big community, but she's in Newfoundland where there aren't that many people. But if you walked a day in Montreal, you'd hit thousands of people, right? Go ahead, Amy. What were you going to say in terms of size?
Well, again, I mean, I think it's very hard to define. Like, we played with that, and I don't think you can, because every neighborhood and community looks different and is spatially different for every resident living in that community. But if we think about this idea of practical, it has to be available every day, if not, so it has to be on your way home from work, on your way to home, things that make it really, really easy to participate. So I think that's really important. If the north end of Halifax is very far spread apart, so if you've got some pieces of the infrastructure over at one end and some at the other, a person's only going to focus or be able to get to one. So I think accessibility is really critical in achieving this outcome of practical everyday participation. And we all define our neighborhoods and communities in very different ways. And again, I think people should be able to do that and choose the ways in which they want to participate.
Yeah, I mean, and for instance, in a suburban community, it might be not how far you can walk, but how far you can drive. And how do you define that? A question for you, Tessie, from Jane, asking for the borough of 200,000, how many shops and maker spaces? Any idea?
Yeah, so we've got five shops which are project incubator spaces across the borough. We've got a large 3,000 square meter makerspace, but we're also trying, as we evolve, we've got about, we're aiming by the end of the year to have about 100 Tomorrow Today streets, which are street level hubs. So all the time we're trying to bring the activity, just as Amy was describing, as close to where people live as possible. So people won't get on a bus to go and batch cook for an hour. So every estate should have a shared kitchen. They should have a shared place to eat. They should have a space to grow and repair and make and all those sorts of things, because we're trying to build this we're sort of trying to retrofit this into our neighborhoods. And if we look at across the UK, and I've been to so many places, there are literally thousands of spaces which are community halls, or and they're set up for a variety of things. They push the chairs at the end of the day to the side. They've got a kitchen which has got a kettle and a sink, and you can fit in 2 bottles of milk. You can't cook together, you can't eat together. They're non-functional, but they're also not used. So we've got all of this capacity which has been set up for events and meetings, and then we're surprised that communities only have events and meetings. We need this functionality.
We need more
functionality.
Yeah. So we need to engage the design community, often who come on to City Talks. I hope they're listening to you, about how do we adapt these spaces. And as Pam said, all the questions of land and property, why aren't they being repurposed just as matter of course to these kinds of flexible civic spaces? Yeah. Okay, well, we've only got a few more minutes left, and I'm wondering if we could just pull it up one level in terms of what you think Participatory Cities Canada can start to lead on. What are the key lessons? And you've got an interesting model that includes learning architecture, resources, vision. I'm looking at your report with that nice round visual context and evidence. So there seems to be a kind of magic kind of formula that you're trying to devise to see if you can advance this, get it more sustainably funded, obviously, and then adapt it. You can see people in the chat saying, how much does it cost to prototype one of these, all that kind of stuff. Karen, I'm going to come to you next, just for general kinds of responses to what you've been seeing in the chat. And then let's go around to each person, if I could, and just say, what would you prioritize in terms of moving this to the next level, whatever that means. Go to you, Karen, first.
Yeah. There's been lots of stuff popping up, and I just want to be able to kind of touch on that. First, I guess, in terms of this question around density. So beyond Toronto, Montreal, and Halifax this past year that is actively prototyping and working with multiple teams. We've been also having conversations with folks in Edmonton and Laval. 2 cities are actually fairly, quite spread. And one of the questions that keeps coming up is that, Montreal, Toronto is actually fairly dense. What does it look like in the more suburban communities? And I think that point about walking is quite important, and that is there are a number of design principles within the participatory city approach. There's 14 or 15, but within walking distance is actually one of them. So accessibility. there's, that whole thing, there's many questions about adapting, and I know learning has been touched on. And I will just say this, one of my greatest joy every month is to bring all three of these teams together to learn from each other. And I think that community of learning and of practice, particularly during a pandemic when like no one has done this before in this circumstance, is really valuable, because each team actually builds upon one another's knowledge. Maybe what we're hearing from Linden might be a baseline, but each of them have taken such different directions. And then learning about like, what is the COVID restriction like in your city, in your community? What are you doing around this issue? And the goal here is that, it's not about replicating, but each time this is being done, it should be bigger, it should be better, it should be, different, but, we're building upon one another. And we've been working with some of the coaches from Tessie's team in London, and there's that learning is very much reciprocated, and I'll just say that too. Traditionally as McConnell Foundation, we're a funder. We get proposals, we fund grants, but I've been involved in this project in a very different kind of way, that we're learning together, we're co-creating together, and I'm part of, we're all part of this community. To that question about resources, so we started, so this Participatory Canada is part of a bigger social R&D portfolio, which is part of the federal government's investment readiness program. And each of the cities started with, $100,000 in grants, but that was matched with, significant resources, both in cash and in kind locally. And so there's just been a lot of support and interest, within that local ecosystem. I feel like, considering like all that has happened in the past year, one thing we have learned is that you need resources. If you want to do this well, if you want to be really intentional, you need resources. You can test, in a small way, but in order to kind of go to the next level, and I guess your question is like, how do you kind of move to the next level is, and I actually think we've touched on it earlier, is how do we see social infrastructure as a public good, and how can we start to rethink that in terms of the public sector, and how can we fund it to the ambition that we want it to be. And I guess the last point I want to touch on is this question about resistance. You had asked about that, and what I will say that there's it's not exactly a resistance, but there's been skepticism for sure. Like this looks just like every other community project. We have collective kitchen, we have community garden, we have all this and this and this. And why should we care? Why should we do this? And I would just emphasize that, I think everybody here has such long history and experience, deep experience doing so many of these kinds of amazing community projects, and those things are still absolutely necessary. But what we're talking about is that weaving together, and building capacity, and always involving people who might not normally get involved, in the civic conversation. And to me, that foundation of building that kind of infrastructure at the neighborhood level is the basis we need for a more engaged, civic landscape, let's just call it. So that was a lot, but and sorry, one more thing about this question. I think it came up around sustainability. One thing that has been really interesting, at least for me, is learning about this whole idea of compound outcomes. So social cohesion, as Tessie said, is super priority, but it also matters what people are doing. You want to circulate, you want to upcycle, you want to really ensure that the materials and goods are kind of circulating within a very hyper local context. Denise talked about hydroponics, and I think there's bike repair, like everything's happening so locally that has like tremendous impact on circular economy and certainly sustainability.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yeah, that was a lot there, Karen. Thank you for just blitzing through it. I mean, the chat is full of really good stuff, and we always post the chat on City Talk, so don't panic, folks. If you haven't, I'll take all those links down. You're going to get them when you see the conversation posted. Am I the only one that has a bit of nervousness about government coming in and funding this? I'm worried that they will wreck it. with all their rules and their top down whatevers. And I don't know, am I the only one that worries about that? I mean, I know that that's not the answer, because communities need resources and we can't keep doing these things on the backs of whatever, but I just want to just get a pulse on people about how do we keep this ground up, responsive, innovative, creative. I'm going to go to Denise and then Maud and then Amy and then Tessie, last word. Only got 5 minutes, guys. You got to be brief. Go, Denise.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I don't like rules ever, and I think that these programs work because there are no rules. The idea of getting to yes and making things happen is hard when you have funders who want reports and who want specific outcomes and who want, this has been a lovely sandbox to be able to play in. I'm not so worried about government funding these things as I am worried about the things that they want from us if they do fund it. I think that we have to stop with this anemic funding of programs, and we have to start looking similar to the model that Tessie has in the UK. We have to start looking at large infrastructure investment that allows things to happen that we can't account for when we're writing a one-year funding proposal. And so I would love to have government money. They have the kind of money that we need to do this kind of thing. But I'm worried about them continuing to fund these things in this way that is what I call drip drop funding. That, like, don't give me this little tiny bit, give me a large bit, and let's make a plan to do something good with it, as opposed to this, like, every year we have to report back on what happened, what didn't happen, why didn't that happen, or maybe you won't get the funding next year. We need to stop that and move forward. So yes, I want government money. No, I don't want the traditional rules of government money.
Yeah, sustainable funding that has more open, and maybe the money has to come locally, so then that it raises the larger spectrum of how municipalities get their resources. Over to you, Maud.
I don't think I can add any more than what Denise just said. She really summed it up very, very well. I'd be very sad if I left this Zoom call and I didn't talk about what's coming up, what we are prioritizing in Ahuntsic. So for us, it's definitely going to be what are the interesting things that are coming up. It's the shop front, it's the makerspace. It's something that was already planned by Solon, and we're really, really excited. I'm just very nervous about everything that's coming up. We also have a project that we're developing with citizens, and it's found its way onto the Montreal participatory budget. So Montreal has this great initiative where citizens can go vote for the projects, their favorite projects. So if there are any Montrealers in the audience today, please look it up, le budget participatif de Montréal, l'espace meilleur. So it's this vacant lot that we're going to convert with the citizens of Fleury West, see what they want to do, community garden, whatever. So it's like an outdoor meeting space, outdoor maker space. And that's it. And continue to build links, continue to build connections. Thanks.
You're pregnant with things, possibilities. That's fantastic. Wonderful. Amy, last word to you, and then Tessie for a quick goodbye.
Yeah, I think number one for us, this is foundationally a learning model. And so unfortunately, we did not get to go to London and see this thing in action. And I think it's really critical to building the case for this, because this work, as we've talked about, it is rooted in relationships, but is very, very simple, right? So if we think about monumental shifts like reconciliation, you can actually imagine, not to undermine all the work that's required of Canadians to understand what that work is, but personal transformation that comes through relationships with residents. So I think in terms of getting cities and governance on board, this is like, no question, this is about rigorous investigation and systematic approach. And I think Participatory City has demonstrated what's possible with the evaluation and the outcomes. So we can do that. But let's remember that the outcomes need to be felt and named by the community that's feeling them, right? So if a government is saying this is what we want to see, I think we need to flip that conversation and say, this is what's valuable for our communities in terms of social and economic resilience, and serve them a platter of here's how we're going to get there. Maybe it's a service contract, who knows, but it does not need to be a bunch of money tied to a whole bunch of methods through which we achieve economic and social resilience. I think that's very, very important. And yeah, I mean, so I would say for us in Halifax, what's very important, Tessie already named it, we have to build that base infrastructure that can demonstrate some of what's possible with this. So for me, I'm very focused on the infrastructure, the teams existing and new that can pull this together and really demonstrate in the flesh some of these outcomes that we're talking about.
Yeah, well, this is the moment to do it, isn't it? As we come out of COVID and we figure out what are we building back and how do we build back better? 30 seconds to you, Tessie.
Oh, the pressure.
Yeah.
I think just to your point about government, I think that we've been really trapped for a very long time in thinking about top down and bottom up. And actually it's so unhelpful. And I think what we're really inventing here is a way of finding a new way where government does what it does well, residents do what it does well, and a new configuration, a reorganization of that. And I think that local, national government have to be involved in that. It's part of a change process, a transition to a new future, and they need to be part of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we kind of got to work together on this and walk together in whatever the new future is. Well, honestly, gals, you're fantastic. And I know everybody's leaving and they're going to be pressing those links and Googling and learning all about participatory cities. Let's encourage them to wade through your report. It's an ambitious piece that you've put there. Lots to think about, really, and beautiful visually. So it's easier to read than lots of other dense things that we get across our desks. So, and you're all grounded in what's actually happening in your community. So thanks for joining us. Tessie, always great to see you. Maude, I'm excited for you about all that you've got going on in those neighborhoods. I hope I can get to Montreal this summer now that the public health guidelines allow us to travel. Amy and you and Pam, would you thank Pam before she had to leave earlier? Denise in Regent Park, thanks so much. And Karen in Edmonton, and good luck with your next chapter. We're back. I was going to comment, that it's probably not a total coincidence that we're all women on this call, just saying. And on Thursday, we're actually at CUI doing a whole session of CityTalk on it's all about the gender gap and how the gender gap has been reinforced during COVID. So I'm hoping that you'll join us. We're doing 2 conversations. It's with the Pay Equity Commission in Ontario and with support from Libro Credit Union and Advantis, our data partner who has data on households across the country. And obviously this is a pretty serious thing. You wouldn't know it from this call because it's women changing the world here. But post-COVID, we're going to have lots of reckoning to do as women have left the workforce in larger numbers than historically we've ever seen during COVID. And what's that reentry going to look like? What are the implications? And how can we actually close that gender gap? Because cities, as was so evidenced here, cities and neighborhoods need women. So thanks everybody for joining us. And we're looking forward to the next chapter of Participatory Cities Canada and Participatory Cities, wherever it's going to go, Tessie, next. Thanks everybody. Have a good day.
Bye.